Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be finally, and I say finally because it has been probably 5 years now, we're going to be continuing my Bob Dylan album review series that I started, I think it was back in about 2014, and yeah, I managed to get through two. I did two album reviews in this series before obviously things got in the way. I kind of ceased to do YouTube for a long time, so today we're going to be returning to that series, and we're going to be talking about, thankfully, one of my absolute favourite Dylan albums. I think one of his best albums, and if I'm being honest, I think it's one of the best albums of all time. And of course I am talking about Bringing It All Back Home from 1965. This album was released on March the 22nd, 1965, and is a classic case of Dylan's famous quick bursts of creativity that he was capable of at this time. He actually recorded this whole album in 3 days. It took him 3 days to record this masterpiece, and it only took him about 3 or 4 months to write the entire album as well. So this is very much at the peak of Dylan's songwriting capabilities and just his amazing ability to churn out masterpieces just on demand. I'm going to give you a bit of background on the album first. So you have to go back to late 1964 to really get a sense and a flavour for the origin of this album. And this was a time when Dylan's songwriting was starting to become more surreal, more dreamlike in its construction and composition, and he was pulling from a wider source of influences. Of course, his first 3 or 4 albums were more Guthrie-esque, and he was very much doing the folk thing on the first few albums. As much as I love them, they are fairly limited in their scope. At this time, he was being influenced by beat poets of the time, of course Allen Ginsberg being the most famous of the beat poets. Also poets like William Blake and Arthur Rimbaud, famously, who was starting to have much more of an effect and an impact on Dylan's songwriting. Now, Dylan was writing at such a frenetic pace at this time, it's kind of hard to conceive of how quickly he was writing these tracks. And I think Clinton Halen, one of Dylan's biographers, probably puts it best when he says that Dylan was moving at the artistic equivalent of the speed of light. And he says, going from Love Minus Zero to Visions of Johanna in 11 months. I think that's a nice way to put it. I think he was in a space artistically that very few people have been in before. Particularly in the kind of music realm and in the popular music realm, for sure. So it's also important not to look past the influence of bands like the Beatles, who Dylan met in 1964, I believe in August. The Beatles were very much important for Dylan's evolution musically, I would say, away from just the purely acoustic folk sound of his first few albums to a more eclectic, varied sound on the mid-60s albums. So now that I've given you a bit of background on the album, I'm now going to delve into the track listing. I'm going to go through each track and tell you a bit of background on each track, and also obviously my opinion on the songs, and maybe give you an idea of which songs I prefer, which songs I like the most, and some songs that I maybe dislike or like less. So the first song on the album is, of course, the famous Subterranean Homesick Blues, probably the most famous song on the album. And this song, he changed many of the lyrics. You go back to the original draft of this song and some of the first takes of the song, and the lyrical composition is completely different. There are some alternate lines in the song, and some funny lines in there, like Daddy's in the dime store getting 10-cent medicine, which I quite liked. And another one which was, careful if they tail you, they only want to nail you, which is rather ominous. Some people argue this is the first rap song in history, and although I wouldn't go that far, it's clear to me that Dylan was pulling a lot from the kind of R&B sound that was becoming more popular at this time, and that can clearly be seen in the melody that he used for Subterranean Homesick Blues. And that is evidenced by Dylan using Chuck Berry's melody for Too Much Monkey Business and adapting it for this song, which is pretty interesting. The other thing of note, of course, about this song is the famous music video, and this was one of the first of its kind, and yeah, you could say revolutionary in terms of being one of the first music videos from a popular artist. What do I think about this song? I mean, it's a classic. It's I think I'd struggle to find anybody, any Dylan fan that didn't like this song. I think over time maybe I've overplayed it sometimes, which has taken away from some of its magic. I must have heard this song thousands of times by now, so yeah, there is that, and I think it's lost some of its appeal for me over the years, but it's still a classic. Now, the next song on the album is She Belongs to Me, of course. This song is interesting in the fact that Dylan chose to use it as the opener to each one of his 1966 concerts during his famous world tour of that year. So he clearly felt an attachment to the song, and yeah, it's a nice come down. It's a nice change of pace from the frenetic Subterranean Homesick Blues, which really kicks the album off. She Belongs to Me brings it down a peg or two, and yeah, the lyrics very ironic, very mocking in the way that Dylan was so famous for doing at this period in his career. And yeah, the lyrics are pretty comical again. You've got lines like bow down to her on Sunday, salute her when her birthday comes, which has always been one of my favourite lines. So Dylan playing around with language and really making the audience think pretty hard about what he's saying. So yeah, big fan of this song. Next song is Maggie's Farm. Now this is interesting in the fact that this was the only song that Dylan was sure that he wanted to be fully electric. I'm not sure whether he recorded an acoustic version, but he was always intent on this being an electric song. And it would become more famous clearly because of the Newport Folk Festival in July of '65, and this was the song he used to famously go electric that year. Went down in history, one of the most famous moments of the '60s, where Dylan defied the folk purists and kind of left that period in his career behind. I always think this is quite a rebellious song, well, very rebellious song, quite aggressive in the way Dylan delivers it. He's, shouting these lyrics at the audience, and yeah, I like Maggie's Farm a lot. I think it's I'd say almost it's more of a protest song than anything he'd done prior to this. People think that his early music was they were protest songs. I would argue Maggie's Farm is a protest song, but in more of a direct way, and he's not pointing fingers at anyone specifically. It's more of a put down song, which he of course would do many more times over the years. So yeah, big fan of Maggie's Farm too. Next up we have Love Minus Zero Over No Limit. Pretty funny title. This of course is it's a fraction. The title is actually a fraction, and it's funny because Dylan would often describe his music as mathematical music at this period in time, and yeah, this title goes to prove it. I mean, he's using fractions, so that's maths, right? It contains references to the Book of Daniel in the Bible, so you've got religious overtones to this song, and I would go as far to say this is my second favourite track on the album. I'm a huge fan of Dylan's use of language in this song. Yeah, I always see this song as Dylan painting a picture of the kind of ideal lover, the ideal muse, in the fact that this person seems to be very unattached, very free-thinking, and doesn't require any external validation. I think these were topics and these were subjects that Dylan was thinking about at the time, and it's interesting to hear him articulate that in a song like this. The last line I've always found to be one of the most interesting, where Dylan says, "My love, she's like some raven at my window with a broken wing." And to me, this kind of points to the fact that people who have these virtues and these qualities in their character are often kind of shunned by society, and perhaps being virtuous in the way that Dylan's describing this person to be is not always a good thing, because they run up against people in society who will drag them down. So that's kind of how I always see that final line. But what I think is great about this song is how it's so open to various interpretations. So yeah, big fan of this song. So now I would say we see a bit of a downward turn in the trend of this album. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that I think ruins it in any way. The next song is called Outlaw Blues, and this song is a fun moment. It's a fun moment on the album. I just wouldn't say it's up to the same standard as the tracks that came before, or the tracks that would come in the second half. But it's a fun moment. It's a nice bit of relief, again, from the pretty heavy subject and pretty densely packed lyrics that Dylan's delivering on a lot of the tracks here. So it's okay. Then we have On the Road Again, which I would argue is probably my least favourite moment on this album. Again, it's not terrible. I think it would have fit better on an album like Another Side of Bob Dylan, which is more funny, more light-hearted in the way it's put together. I wouldn't say it really works that well on Bring It All Back Home, just because of the quality of the rest of the songs on here. I just think he could have done with not including this one. But again, it's not terrible, and it's a fun moment, so I'm not going to beat up too much on this song. Track number 7 is Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. This one is my favourite of the 3 lighter tracks, I guess you could say, on the album. It's very comical, and it's very typical of the way Dylan had been writing for the kind of previous year before this album came out. It could have fit again on Another Side of Bob Dylan, I would say, but this is the one that works the best on Bring It All Back Home, because it's so well written, and Dylan takes us on this kind of wild journey through his mind and through this absurdist world that he's built, and introduces us all to all these characters that we know from history, and places them into these weird and unexpected contexts. That just makes it fun to listen to. It never fails to put a smile on my face when I hear it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of this song. Track number 8 is, of course, Mr. Tambourine Man. Mr. Tambourine Man, what can you say about this track? This is a classic, one of Dylan's greatest songwriting achievements. And clearly from the history of this track, you see that it's a song that Dylan felt very close to, very attached to, and he didn't want to let it go. He'd written this song nearly a year prior to recording it for Bring It All Back Home in February of 1964. The song gets a controversial rap sometimes from certain journalists and certain people who see it as a drug song, a drug-induced song, or being about taking drugs in general. I've always hated those comparisons and those descriptions, because I feel like they're unfounded, and there's nothing in the lyrics that explicitly allude to drugs or the taking of drugs. So I've never liked the comparisons, and I think it's just too simplistic in general. But yeah, this is a seminal moment in Bob Dylan's songwriting career, I would say. He manages to find solace in these words, and I always get the feeling when I'm listening to this song of a kind of deep-rooted security, and of just feeling like everything's going to be okay. I can't quite describe it, but it's one of those weird sensations that you can only get from listening to a song of this quality. My favourite versions come from the '66 World Tour, of course. Dylan had it front and centre of the acoustic set during those shows. You also get these amazing harmonica solos that he played that just seem to kind of soar into infinity, which are they're just mind-blowing. They're some of the best moments from the '66 tour, and I think that is where he found the perfect composition of Mr. Tambourine Man. So yeah, incredible song. I can't say enough about how much I love Mr. Tambourine Man. One of my favourites on the album for sure. Track 9, we have Gates of Eden, and this is where the album starts to take a darker turn, a more brooding, foreboding type of feel. Gates of Eden is a very underrated track, I would say, in Dylan's canon. It's not a song that gets referenced in many greatest hits compilations, and it's generally overlooked on this album. But it's very cryptic, obviously very esoteric and difficult to interpret on first listen. It's one of those songs that requires many listens, and even after many listens, it can feel quite perplexing because there's so many references here to abstract concepts and to things that don't quite make sense on the surface. But that's obviously one of the things I love about Bob Dylan is how he's able to write in such a relatable and understandable way 1 minute, and then turn around and give you a song like Gates of Eden where nothing really makes sense, but you still find a great sense of meaning in it, if that makes any sense. Clinton Halen says that Dylan was reading the I Ching, obviously the Chinese, I think it's Chinese book of divination at the time, which was having an influence on his songwriting, and especially songs like Gates of Eden were being influenced by Dylan's reading of the I Ching at this particular time. So yeah, interesting track, and definitely one of the highlights on the album for me. So we're really getting into the good stuff now, and this next track I would easily say is in my top 5 Bob Dylan songs, probably of all time. Of course, I'm talking about It's Alright Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. This is a track that's never stopped fascinating me and kind of immersing me with its complexity, but also its just infectiousness. It's so infectious to listen to, and it never fails to draw me in a very visceral sense. This is an interesting song because even Dylan has talked about this one over the years being a song that even he can't quite work out how he wrote. He said in a 60-minute interview that he can do other things now. He was like 50, 60 years old at the time. And he said he can do other things now, but he can't write songs like It's Alright Ma anymore. It was a song that, again, I think he valued very highly. There's another quote that he gave to journalist Nat Hentoff, and he said, "There's only one way to change things, and that's to cut yourself off from all the chains. It's Alright Ma is the sound of a chainsaw revving." And I think that quote perfectly kind of encapsulates the mood of this song and how biting and how vicious it is in its attacks on various social institutions, on the education system, on various players in the social arena. And I just find it endlessly fascinating and just an incredible achievement. And for that reason, it's my favourite on the album by quite a distance, I would say. There's so many lines on this song that I could pick out as being highlights, but probably my favourite would be the line, "My eyes collide head-on with stuffed graveyards, false gods I scuff, at pettiness which plays so rough." I've just always loved that play of words that he uses, and yeah, that's just a typical line in this song that I just think is such a standout. Last but by no means least, we have the final track on the album, which is It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. This is another song that he played during the '66 World Tour, and that kind of immortalized this song for me as being a standout. He couldn't decide whether he wanted it to be electric or acoustic, and he definitely recorded it both as acoustic and electric. Finally settled on it being an acoustic song, and I think it works well as a closer for the album. It's got a very melancholy feel to it. It feels quite dark, but at the same time maybe slightly lighter in tone than the two previous songs before it, Gates of Eden and It's Alright Ma. It's also one of my favourite vocal performances on the album, I would say. I think Dylan's singing on this song is really, really solid. I'm a big fan of Bob Dylan's voice. I know it divides opinion and some people can't stand the sound of Dylan's voice. I've always loved his voice on most albums. But yeah, on this song I think it's just really powerful and just fits the tone of the lyrics really, really well. So yeah, it's he conveys a real sense of regret on the part of the kind of beleaguered subject on this song. And it's, as I say, it's dark in some ways, but also has a kind of lightness and a resolution to it that doesn't leave too dark of a taste in the listener's mouth when they get to the end of this song. So yeah, so it's a really good end to a near perfect album for me. So in summary, what's my conclusion on Bringing It All Back Home as a collection of songs, as an album? I would honestly say it's near to perfect. As I just said, it just encapsulates everything I love about Dylan. And you know, previously I would have put it in my top 5, probably below the album that would follow this, Highway 61 Revisited. But after re-listening to both of them, I would honestly say that I'd prefer this one to Highway 61 in many ways. I think both are masterpieces, but this would be slightly above for me. And yeah, I just see it as an album where Dylan just set a new standard for the genre, whatever genre he was operating in. I think the genre of this album is very hard to define. Some people like to put the folk rock tag on this album, and I think that's fair in some ways and unfair in other ways. And it's definitely a distinction that Dylan himself didn't like. So for me, this is where Dylan's songwriting really took a U-turn, and he started to move firmly away from the more topical material he was writing in the early 60s towards a kind of more potent hybrid of this surreal world building combined with the influences he was taking from beat poets, which is pretty interesting in itself. And obviously he was using more variety in his instrumentation, incorporating more instruments, and I think it just makes for a much more rich experience for the listener. And you got to remember, this was something that I don't think anybody had really heard before, certainly in popular music and in rock music. This album is very hard to compare to anything else. The only albums I would think to compare this to are other Bob Dylan albums. I can't think of any other artist who made an album or has even made tracks that compare to the tracks you can hear on these mid-60s albums, which for me is why albums like this are up there as some of the best of all time. I think the album really benefits from having both acoustic songs and electric songs. I think if Dylan had gone down the path of just having an electric album or just having an acoustic album, would have made the album not as impactful on me personally. The way it finally came out, I feel like it never gets stale, never gets repetitive, and it's always throwing these curveballs at you that take you by surprise and keep you very much immersed in the experience, which I think is a massive positive for this album. So to recap, a few of my favourite tracks on the album, you've got It's Alright Ma, Mr. Tambourine Man, Gates of Eden, and Love Minus Zero Over No Limit. On the weaker side, my least favourite tracks would be On the Road Again and Outlaw Blues. but it very much is an album where I'm having to nitpick to pick out the bad tracks. Even the tracks I don't like, I still find enjoyable and fun to listen to. I just don't think they quite come up to the same standard as songs like It's Alright Ma, which are just mind-blowing. So the last thing is to give a quick shout out, and that's to the Dylan biographer Clinton Halen, who you might have heard me reference a few times in this video. This is his book, Revolution in the Air, The Songs of Bob Dylan, Volume 1, 1957 to 1973. Of course, there's a Volume 2 as well, which covers the later years. This is a great book if you're interested in Dylan's songwriting process or his recording sessions. This basically breaks down every single song that he wrote during those years and just gives you a nice reference on every track. So yeah, I would highly recommend this. And yeah, without Clinton Halen, I wouldn't know half as much as I do about Dylan. So definitely pick this up if you get a chance. So thank you very much for watching. If you got to this point, it's been nice to delve back into this album review series that I started all those years ago. And I want to try and continue on and hopefully make a review for Highway 61 Revisited, which is obviously the next album to be reviewed. So yeah, hopefully I can get that done in the next few weeks. But as always, if you've got any suggestions, anything you want me to talk about, leave me a comment and I will do my best to get something done. So yeah, thank you for watching and I will see you next time.